Well, welcome everybody to another episode of the Gript weekly live stream. Unfortunately, we are not Fatima Gunning and Gary Kavanagh. They are both otherwise occupied with important business, so we figured we would fill in a kind of a live edition of the podcast almost. It's not quite what's going on here, but it's if you've ever wondered what that will be like, you're about to experience it. So hopefully it doesn't disappoint. We were going to talk a little bit about the amazing proposal to reduce the voting age to 16, which was put forward by the Social Democrats in the Dáil just yesterday. They put forward a piece of legislation to be discussed. And before we get into the merits or demerits of that proposal and whether it's a good idea, I think most people can probably intuit and guess what we think about this. But before we even go there, I just find it fascinating that literally every single political party within the Oireachtas, to the best of my knowledge, has endorsed this policy at one point or another. Fine Gael have backed it, at least verbally. Fianna Fáil have backed it, at least verbally. Sinn Féin, the Social Democrats, People Before Profit, Labour, even some people who you wouldn't expect, some of the independents who would be more conservative leaning, have said that they would be open to it. And so you have this cross-party unanimous support for an idea, and it just never gets implemented. And that's been the case for years. And I just find it kind of amusing that there is nothing in theory holding them back from doing it. Now, as we're about to get into, I don't think they should do it. I don't want them to ever do it for reasons which will hopefully become clear soon. I think it's a terrible idea, but I think it says something interesting about the psyche of politicians that they can simultaneously give lip service to an idea while knowing it will be a disaster if they tried to actually do it and make good on what they were saying. So I don't know if you have any thoughts or reaction to that development.
I have thoughts. I mean, far from thinking it's a good idea. I rarely say anything. Well, I rarely say anything in a radical way, but I don't mind doing so here. I actually think the voting age should be bloody raised, never mind lowered. I think it should be up, 21 or something like this. Or I'm also not opposed to radical ideas like parents getting more votes because the sort of skin in the game they have in the future of society. But that's neither here nor there. On the matter of 16-year-olds voting, I actually think some of the, while the Social Democrats obviously endorse it, and some of the parties that are aligned with them on various issues, I think that it was a Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil were a little more canny in their responses to you, because you obviously asked both Micheál Martin and Simon Harris about this yesterday, wasn't it?
Yeah, but actually I was interested in that because it was a little bit of a scattergun kind of result where they gave very different answers effectively. So Simon Harris said, look, I'm open to a debate on it, but frankly, I'm not convinced that this is a good idea, and particularly not right now, given that there's so much important stuff happening. He didn't say explicitly, but we can infer he probably means things like the tariffs and the future of the economy and so on. He said, like, we don't really have time for this right now, but like we can discuss it. But I don't think it's really the time or the place for that sort of carry on. Meanwhile, I asked Micheál Martin, and he seemed a lot more positive about it. He said, oh yeah, I don't see any problem with that. I've long thought that that was a reasonable idea. And I asked him, would you rule out having such a referendum? Because of course it would require a constitutional change. I said, would you rule out something like that in the next 5 years during the lifetime of this government? And he says, oh no, I wouldn't rule anything out in that regard. So they seem to be of different views. I asked Hildegard Naughton, the junior minister. She said she would like to keep it at 18 and that she thinks it's fine as is. And then I asked Norma Foley, who didn't really answer, but what's new? So,
well, if I can interject there, Norma Foley's answer to me was nuts. I know she said she was unfamiliar with the piece of legislation in question, or the motion in question, but she said, she's at the beginning of her answer, she likened it. She was like, well, they already vote in, say, student council elections and things like this. And I was like, I nearly fell out of my chair when I heard that. I was like, so you're going to liken student council politics, which, to be fair, doesn't look dissimilar to a lot of the national politics most of the time anyway, but you're going to liken that to, yeah, national politics, where you decide Ireland's stance on taxes, or you decide Irish tax policy, you decide Irish international relations stances and things like this. I mean, it's just laughable. But just to go back to what Micheál Martin and Simon Harris were saying, I think that they were typically clever in their responses, and that neither of them endorsed what was being put forward yesterday. Neither of them explicitly said, I'm in support of this particular motion, but they both say, in principle, I'm not opposed to this, which obviously doesn't bind them to doing anything, here and now about it. And indeed, as you said, as much about Micheál Martin's responses were kicked it into the long grass. But I so there's just so much wrong with this from my perspective. I mean, they keep talking about the need to get young people involved in politics. And, my stance is why? Why do we need to get young people involved in politics? It's this idea that politics is the most important sphere of human activity. I think you and I would both disagree with that. And I think there comes a time when it's good to be politically engaged and whatnot, but I'm not convinced that 16 is it. Just another point that I want to make, lest I forget, is that one of the dumbest arguments I saw forward yesterday was someone saying that there's not that much difference between, I can't remember who said it now, but there's not that much difference between a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old. So, why don't we lower the voting age to 16? It's like, well, why wouldn't you just keep applying that principle then? It's like there's not that much difference between a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old once you've changed the voting age. So I think, it's one of these areas where our sentimentality will come back to bite us in the ass, which is that, lovely utopian idea, every citizen involved that can be in the vote. And it's like, yeah, if you want sensible voting, which we don't necessarily get at the best of times, this isn't the way to do it.
Yeah, and also, by the way, I agree with everything you just said, but in addition to that, there is quite a substantial difference between 16 and 18. That is actually a significant psychological difference. And I mean, you're a parent of young children. I'm a parent of young children, or child, hopefully children in the future. And one of the things you'll notice as a parent is that your kids radically change every week, it feels like, let alone every month or every year. Like, I mean, particularly when they're a baby, obviously they've got a new head every time you look at them. You go, what the hell? Where did that facial feature come from? I don't remember his nose being shaped like that. That's the kind of radical alteration you undergo. And obviously that's very extreme when you're younger, when you're a baby or a toddler, but that kind of pace continues at a slightly slower rate as you get older. A 15-year-old can be mad into a lot of hobbies. Maybe he's really into a particular sport, and then all of a sudden he's 16 and he couldn't give less of a crap about that sport, and now he's mad into music or whatever.
Here's an interesting question. How similar to your 16-year-old self are you now?
I believe I was a communist then, and I was Buddhist, and I had a lot of, so yeah, very, very dissimilar. I was actually quite shy and introverted, so yeah, not exactly words that people
where'd that go
now. Yeah. So sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, on my part then, yeah, I was an atheist who was just pretty much went with the flow in terms of, I was kind of like, abortion and cases of rape and incest and things like this. So that's all just to say I didn't really think critically about things. I just sort of outsourced my thinking on politics essentially to the mainstream discourse, which, as viewers might guess, would certainly be to the benefit of mainstream political parties. And I mean, there's just this phrase that comes to mind for me is this weaponization of the youth. It's like, this is a time of your life meant for sort of developing your thought and whatnot, and that is not a good foundation for shaping national politics. Like, you see it in this, I know we were talking about it on the podcast on Monday, but this effort to make young people activists through this climate action and sustainable development leaving certificate course. Why can't we just kick politics into adulthood as it should be and leave them sort of figure their things out, and hopefully help them figure things out well in the meantime?
Yeah, I mean, we obviously have examples of young people who get involved in activism, who have a good head on their shoulders, who are intelligent and reasonable, and who have considered the issues. And that's great. And they're entitled to their views, and they are entitled to even engage in that kind of activism. I mean, later on, we're going to talk about Cara Darmody, and obviously her protest and her movement has done very well. It's had a big influence on the
Mm-hmm.
conversation around autism services and things. I believe her siblings have autism, and so this is something that she's very passionate about. And she's 14, and she's very entitled and within her rights to do all of that, and nobody would criticize her for it. I certainly wouldn't. So
Mm-hmm.
none of that is the problem. But the fact is, when you're talking about millions and millions of people, or I guess in the case of people under 18, it's probably more like hundreds of thousands, but still, you're talking about a huge society full of people. It is obviously the case that younger people's brains typically, generally, are not sufficiently robust to they haven't solidified who they are and what they believe yet. They also have no stakes, no long-term stakes in things like, I mean, this is an extreme example. I'm not saying this is likely to happen, but one of the reasons we gave 18-year-olds the vote is because 18-year-olds are eligible for the draft. So if we're on a collision course with another country and you're looking at potential warfare, you want to make sure that the people who are voting are the people who are going to be affected by that, not people who can vote for some crazy war that will never impact them directly or something like that. And then again, you mentioned taxes earlier, things like this. The fact is, like one of the fundamental things we always learn in civics class, if you're lucky enough to have a civics class, which everybody should, is that rights necessarily come with responsibilities. They're intertwined and inseparable. And so if younger people have less responsibilities, which they do and which they should, then they necessarily have less rights to things like voting. And that's just the way it is. And if you want more rights to vote in elections and so on, then wait until you're a little bit older and a little bit more responsible, and then happy days, we can proceed as we always have, which is just common sense.
Well, we're in agreement on this one, so why don't we move on to that topic you alluded to, Cara Darmody and her, say, 50-hour protest outside Leinster House. I believe you were outside Leinster House yesterday, obviously, but you weren't able to get up to her because of the media scrum around her. Was that the case?
Yeah, there were. I mean, pretty much every member of the opposition, right wing, left wing, and in between, were out there demonstrating their support for her, and also the government voiced basically a total surrender and mea culpa, saying, you know what, she's absolutely right. Because for those who haven't been following this, if you're not like plugged into the news lately, essentially she's protesting the government's failure to provide timely assessments of need for children with disabilities. So that's a legal process under the Disabilities Act of 2005, which is used to identify a child's health and educational support needs. And the HSE is legally required to complete these within 6 months, but it's extremely long wait times. We know that the HSE is inefficient and that basically the letter of the law is being broken, and there are over 15,000 children who are currently waiting for assessments, and that could rise to over 25,000 by the year's end. Only 7% are actually completed within the legal time frame that they're supposed to. So she's protesting about this. She's 14 years old, doing a 50-hour protest, and this has obviously gotten a lot of media attention. And sort of like the story we were talking about earlier, it's kind of bizarre that everyone in Irish politics seems to agree, yeah, you're right, this is a serious problem, we need to do something about it. Yet it's taken this for them to actually look like they're even considering like this is not a new problem. This is a problem that's existed for a long time. So I don't understand this unanimous agreement combined with no action or no immediate solutions to problems that you've already identified.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, we were, saying, and I still stand by, obviously, young people shouldn't have a vote, but this does strike me as a noble campaign on her part because, as you say, her younger brothers are both directly affected by this, as are literally tens of thousands of other people. And I listened to a little interview with her on, was it Virgin Media, last night, I think it was. And she was saying that, she has had the opportunity to meet with some of the senior politicians. She met with Simon Harris previously. She was due to meet with Micheál Martin this morning. And she has previously sort of been promised action on this. And obviously, I found those figures actually quite stunning that throughout the first quarter of this year, just 7% of assessments were completed within the time frame set out in the legislation. Like, what is that if not catastrophic system failure? I mean, clearly that is what that is. And this is, this is an issue that doesn't affect everyone, but it is supremely important because you and I think would both probably be of the opinion that how a society treats the most vulnerable, its most vulnerable members, is a pretty good indicator of the health of that society. And we just across the board fail on this metric, and that's very much the case here. I mean, you remember during the general election campaign trail, one of the most viral moments of that campaign was when that I forget her name now, but the carer encountered Simon Harris, and he just looked completely flustered and disempowered and incompetent to address her reasonable concerns. So I think that again, this is once again not a good look that you've got, say, a 14-year-old girl deciding to do a 50-hour protest outside the door. Someone might say, oh, just go home. But you would say that I would say anyway, that this is a reasonable example of a young person using their agency to try and affect change, because, she said a lot of things, as that saying goes, out of the mouths of children. It just makes things sound wiser for whatever reason. But she was saying that politicians aren't doing what they're paid to do. The government is, as you said, breaking the letter of the law or something along those lines. And so it is. It's like, maybe if they won't listen to us 20, 28, 29-year-old man, you sitting in your dark room with a beard, and me, clean shaven, which is probably equally questionable despite being the opposite. They might listen to a 14-year-old girl, sleeping out in the streets of Dublin as the weather turns.
Yeah, I mean the government's argument on this is they point to a 2022 High Court ruling which required assessments of children to be very comprehensive. They have to be over 30 hours of assessment, and then they say that this has massively increased the delays and led to a lot of the problem. So the Taoiseach is saying that that's not workable, and they need to change the legislation to make it that it's not just 30 hours across the board, that some people you can streamline more quickly, and other people, if they need more time and attention and assessment, then you can do that too, and that it can pick and choose on a case by case basis. And the opposition are pushing back on that, saying that they're by doing that, you're effectively just changing the law. So it'd be like if I'm driving 10 kilometers over the speed limit and somebody points it out. So then I go, okay, I'm going to just increase this. If I'm the government, I'm just going to increase the speed limit by 10 kilometers. And then I'm not breaking the law anymore. Whoop, hey, but actually, you're still doing the bad thing. You're just not, you've changed the rules. So now you're technically not in breach anymore. I'm not saying I agree with that per se, but that's what I've heard some people use to critique.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's
just do the comprehensive assessment, just do it faster and better and hire more staff and stop fiddling with the goalposts effectively.
Well, I mean, given that HSE funding just keeps growing like a bloody balloon, you would wonder why they can't get this done. But I know you were making that argument, but that argument just doesn't hold water to me. I mean, there's a difference between, say, breaking the law poorly and then changing the law so as to make something good work effectively. It seems to me that whatever way the system is set up now, and according to this argument, it's because of the 30-hour requirement, that's just clearly not working. So yeah, making it more sort of case by doing it on a case by case basis may well be what lowers the overdue application list. But I just think that it's really funny as well. Our government, members of our government, have this really funny behavioral trait where whenever something critical that makes them look bad comes up, they always have this tendency to say, "Oh, this is terrible. We really should do something about this." The difficulty for, most of us can fall back on that, but the difficulty for them is there's no one higher in Ireland to kick that up to. And I just think it's really funny that, this particular issue that, I see one of our commenters saying health of kids is paramount. I mean, I absolutely agree with that. This is something that really should be prioritized. And yet, yesterday, a considerable amount of the political discourse was devoted to lowering the voting age to 16. It's like, and I know that came from an opposition member from a Social Democrat TD, but the time is there, the resources and the will. Well, whether the will is there or not, who knows? But we choose to devote our time to other things. That's the bottom line here.
Yeah, most definitely. And, something else that we should probably be devoting a little bit of time to on this live stream is a new report from our friends over at Europol, the EU's official police force at the European-wide level, who they release every several years this report on organized crime. They have a few different regular reports that they put out, one on terrorism that yourself and myself have both covered extensively in the past. This one is more on gangs, cartels, that sort of thing. And in very stark terms, they laid out that, in their view, organized crime is actually a threat to the stability of the European Union itself and individual member states, that is actually threatening society as a whole. Because they were saying, and I'm paraphrasing, obviously the full report is available online, and I did a report on this on the Gript website, kind of going over some of the more key findings if you're interested. So this is all truncated and paraphrased what I'm about to say. But essentially what they're saying is that, first of all, corruption has gotten so bad in some cases that it actually has an adverse impact on people's trust in democracy and society. And this is specifically corruption connected to criminality, gangs, drug dealing, etc. And also that one of the biggest, most thriving industries within the black market is human trafficking of illegal migrants, and also getting people so-called regularized in a society. So once you sneak an illegal person into the country, then getting them legitimate papers through whatever kind of back channel means, you're able to do that. And they were saying this is a huge industry. Money laundering through the hospitality sector is one of the big ones, that a lot of these gangs, according to Europol, own businesses within the hospitality sector, and they utilize that to, conceal their money transfers and so on. They receive payment through crypto and all of this kind of thing. So another thing we've heard a lot of, social media promotion of these scams. So a guy who'll have a TikTok account, let's say, where he said, hey, if you want to illegally sneak into Ireland, he wouldn't use these words, but effectively what he's saying is, I can get you in. Here's how I do it. Here's how other people have found it during the journey. And so, like, this guy's a human trafficker, and he's got a social media account advertising his services effectively. So yeah, pretty alarming that the European Union's official police force is cognizant of these problems, and I've not heard much about that from our domestic police force, who you would hope will be aware of these things.
Yeah, although to be fair, our police force sort of holds their cards close to their chest. I mean, remember that story earlier this year about the Islamist threat to the St. Patrick's Day parade, if I remember correct. If I remember, it was Islamist, potentially just terrorists. They didn't specify. I can't remember off the top of my head.
No,
But,
it was Islamist specifically, yeah. And ISIS,
oh yeah, ISIS-K.
An offshoot of ISIS, yeah.
Yeah, it was ISIS-K had put out a sort of hit list saying that St. Patrick's Day parade was one of their targets this year. And Europol were first out with acknowledging that. And when you asked the Gardaí, they weren't forthcoming initially about whether they were aware of it or not. If I remember correctly, they ultimately said that they were, but it took a little bit of pulling that result from them. But I would just, not that Europol cares, but I would give them a shout out. Their reports are always really interesting. I find they're always laid out very well. They don't turn away, I would put it this way, from maybe unpopular sources of danger, to put it that way. I just find universally when a Europol report comes out and I see it, I'm like, oh, that's good. That's guaranteed to be interesting. So yeah, I found this one super interesting. And
yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but on that, like, I've not found, I mean, I could be wrong about this, but I've not found Europol to be in any way politically biased in one direction or another, which is strange for many Western institutions, including police forces. Unfortunately, I don't think I could say the same thing about An Garda Síochána. that's just my personal experience. That's how I feel. But Europol will report things that are very inconvenient for both sides of the political spectrum. Like, for example, if you go back over their terrorism reports, you'll find that left-wing anarchist terrorism is far more common than right-wing terrorism. And they just report the facts and say, yeah, look, this is the data. This is what it says. What do you want me to do about it? So yeah, they are very good for that kind of thing in my experience.
100%, but it is funny because I find reports like this definitely do feed into the decline narrative, which is said it's like this idea that organized crime is reaching a pitch that could destabilize the EU. It's like, what the heck is going on there? I did see that, yeah, sort of migrant smuggling was given fairly extensive focus in it, and I thought that was funny. Well, not funny, but it was curious that it coincided with, Keir Starmer, British Prime Minister, is obviously talking tough on immigration now. And he quote tweeted a case from Britain yesterday. There was this guy who helped smuggle over 3,000 people into Europe. He was jailed for 25 years. I mean, that is, if you want to sort of clamp down on this crime, you do have to get back to basics, which is sort of prison sentences like that. Like 25 years, I think, is going to have a lot of, migrant smugglers questioning whether it's worth it or not. Now, to be fair, this guy was based in the UK, which is obviously why I understand he was prosecuted there. Whereas previously you had migrant smugglers obviously based along the North African coast and in Turkey and whatnot, who would sort of bring people through the Mediterranean some of the ways, so they'd sort of be out of the European jurisdiction. But I think we probably wouldn't be facing this situation were it not for a sort of widespread degradation of law and order.
Yeah, most definitely. And it's also, as we all know, and you want to be nuanced and fair about this too, one of the reasons it's so reprehensible to allow human smuggling is that so many of those people end up becoming terribly victimized by the people who are smuggling them in. And you could be callous, you could say, oh, look, who cares? You made the decision to do it. Or, like, I don't, first of all, children don't make those decisions. Their parents might, but the kids are innocent parties and all of that. And moreover, you don't know the situations that these people are going through. That's not me saying we should take them in. Illegal immigration is illegal and it shouldn't be allowed, full stop. But what I mean is, even as somebody who's very much immigration restrictionist in my own views, I feel great sympathy and pity for somebody who's getting preyed on by a predatory gang that is smuggling them into a country. And then you hear horrible stories of women being exploited sexually, or people being forced to work to, like, maybe they couldn't afford to be brought in. They couldn't afford the trafficker's fee. So then once you arrive, you basically become an indentured servant, having to pay off this debt, which is nearly unpayable. And so you're working in a damn, sweatshop effectively in the country you've arrived in, let's say Ireland, paying this mobster who will do horrible things to you if you don't pay up. So yeah, like the point is, it's not good for anyone involved on any level. It's just a disaster, regardless of your views on immigration.
Well, that's it. And I know when it comes to this topic, I always remember reading a while back Douglas Murray's Strange Death of Europe. And he was talking about how very much in 2015, you and I were probably still in school at that stage, but in 2015, during that sort of, that wave of the migrant crisis, migrant smugglers played an absolutely enormous part in facilitating that. They were the ones who were, cramming people into these woefully under-equipped boats. Obviously, a lot of the blame for deaths was put on sort of European governments, say, for, I suppose, not doing enough to prevent that. But we would say one of the best ways to prevent it would be to, tackle smugglers in the first place. They've clearly been, and I know there's difficulties involved in this because a lot of it takes place outside of the European jurisdiction. But as this report makes clear, it's also sort of a growing problem within Europe. So it's definitely one worth, devoting some considerable resources to. But it is just funny. I mean, when you see reports like this coming out, this is a slight tangent, but I'm reading this French author I've really gotten into in the past couple of months, Michel Houellebecq. He wrote that, I think I mentioned to you before, he wrote that famous book, sort of political fiction Submission, about sort of the Islam becoming politically dominant in France. But his most recent novel is called Annihilation, and it's sort of about the general decline of sort of Western societies, particularly France, that it's set in. And he does it like, you don't see societal claps take place in it or anything, but there's all these little nods to, like, this dynamic here is the way in which, France is different to how it was 20 years ago, when generally living standards are better. And I feel like, in our world, it's little things like this, like organized crime could destabilize the EU. I mean, like, when we were kids, I don't know, some smart ass viewer might be able to pull up a report showing something similar from 20 years ago, but I certainly don't think things like that were on the table.
No, and also I heard somebody make an interesting observation that a lot of people think that if some kind of massive social collapse was to happen, it would be like Mad Max almost, where everybody's running around shooting each other with crossbows and there's just anarchy in the streets and things. But
Mohawks, yeah.
yeah, there's a guy in leather with like a shotgun and yeah. But like honestly, the point that this person was making, who I was talking to, which I thought was really interesting, was that it's actually almost impossible to make a society fully collapse, because, as Herodotus said of the Egyptians, they have the habit of civilization. And so even in the most extreme circumstances, societies don't really collapse in that sense, where you've got Venezuela, and for a while people were so hungry that they were breaking into zoos to eat the animals who were also starving. So you're that hungry that, like, you've got no food. You're killing cats and dogs with a spear on the side of the street. And even then, even in those circumstances, people get up, they go to work, they do their job, they come home, they eat their dinner, whatever dinner they can find, they play with their kids, and they go to bed. Like, life continues despite living through a calamity. So the point being, rather than having some kind of chaotic, disastrous, dramatic collapse, it's more just going to be that everything just starts to get crappier. Everything just starts to get a bit worse. You notice, this sounds so mundane and silly in the context of what we're talking about, but you'll notice that every time you order food, the order is wrong, and that it's just like basic incompetence. You're like, what the hell is this? And you'll notice that people like skip you in the queue more when you're waiting for something, and you're like, again, what is going on? You'll notice that things are dirty and there's rubbish everywhere, and people are getting into arguments and fights, and things will still function. They'll just function very, very badly, and the quality of everything will disimprove. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm a very optimistic person, and I think we're going to live through a great period. But I think that the sort of destabilization, or the degradation of society, is a lot less sudden and dramatic than people think. It starts with people. Again, people are going to make fun of me for saying this. They're going to say, "Oh, you're saying that's the beginning of the apocalypse, are you?" Kind of, yeah. I mean, somebody going out wearing their pajamas in public and not showing any respect to the people around them by what they wear. Kind of, yeah. I don't want to go on a big rant. I know we're coming to the end now, but like, I have a distinct memory that always stuck with me when I was a little kid. I must have been like 4 or 5 years old, and I was with my dad at the airport. And as little kids do, I was running around under the rope divider, and I was just doing mad maneuvers through the airport. And my dad said, "Here, listen, you need to stop." And he said, "Do you know what this rope divider is?" And I said, "No." Or I said, "Oh, it's just to stop people from going by." And he said, No. This is civilization. The fact that you can hop over it or under it, and you don't, and you stay on the right side of it, and you go through the queue, that is the foundation of what makes a country worth living in, and actually pleasant life for everybody who lives there. So
your dad was weeping as he told you this.
Yeah. It was a great point, and it was a great illustrative. I mean, I'm talking about it here decades later, so clearly it made an impact, Yeah, I think that's
your son better not crawl under any rope dividers anytime soon.
He's going to get the family lesson, yeah.
But no, I think those were the main things we were going to cover for the moment. Yeah, you anything else to add?
No, I don't think so. And I think we had a great first outing on the live end of things. I appreciate all the comments coming in. I've been taking a glance here, but unfortunately we'll have to cut this short. And I'm sure you guys have overdosed on us this week by now. So we look
Yeah.
forward to seeing you all next week, and hopefully the stream will be back.
We should clarify. They look forward to seeing us maybe on the podcast if they're interested. Probably Gary and Fatima next week.
Yes, absolutely. So with that said, thank you so much, everybody, for watching, and we'll catch you all soon.